Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and I'm delighted to have so many good friends of the Institute, friends of trade, friends of economic debate with us today for our discussion of exploring possible explanations for the slowdown in global trade. A few just observations before we start. You know, it is interesting how policy, and in particular political debate, often tends to look at the last war. And we have a lot of political discussion going on right now in the U.S. and elsewhere about the supposed, I think, real but exaggerated disruption caused by Chinese imports and Chinese expansion a dozen years ago. And I think, as Otto, Dorn, and Hansen have documented, that was real, but it was also unique, and it said something more about the U.S. labor market than it said about trade. And that's an issue which we in the Institute will be confronting repeatedly, as we always have in the coming months. But part of what's been going on, sort of the dirty little secret that is more a puzzle necessarily than a problem, is why, after the rebound of global trade, after the obvious quick, sharp slowdown that occurred during the global financial crisis, are we suddenly back to plateaued global trade? Why, as even the US and China and Western Europe have recovered, admittedly not terribly strongly, but have recovered, have we not seen a resumption of growth in global trade volumes? And what you think that, how much you think that matters, and how much you think there are things to be done about it depends on what you think causes it. And so we are delighted today to have with us a group of both Institute and colleagues from outside the Institute to take different takes on this issue. I'm going to be even more brutal than usual in timekeeping for my colleagues, because there's 5 people and we want them to each get their say and then have room for discussion amongst them and with all of you. But they're a terrific group, and I will introduce them in a moment. I will just say 2 other things quickly. First, it feels good to be getting right back into analytics of trade, just as we did with our TPP assessments that came out recently and other work. Many of you know the Institute wears multiple hats. We are the macro shop, we are the financial crisis shop, and of course we are the trade and investment shop. Last week with the IMF folks in town was sort of macro mania. This week it's terrific trade tableau. And tomorrow we'll be holding another event on the kind of wearing our third hat, which is regional studies, talking about China's new initiative of the Belt Road, which of course is a foreign policy matter, a trade and investment matter, and a financial matter altogether. And Sean Miner and Simeon Jankov will be speaking on that here tomorrow. Another good free lunch at the Institute for those of you who are invited. Another good free video for everyone out there on the web. I also just want to take this opportunity with so many of our friends in the trade community in the room to remind everyone that the Institute has proudly added a new senior fellow, Dr. Chad Bown. Chad, raise your extremely tall hand. Thank you. We've had our eye on Chad for a long time, and thankfully he's had our eye on us. So after a distinguished career at the World Bank, at the White House, and in academia, he is now with us. And though he's not on today's panel, he will be featured soon in Institute programming. So we look forward to Chad and his work and contributions here. Anyway, back to today's topic, which, as I said, is obviously an intellectual topic, a policy topic, and one where there's genuine room for debate and trying to understand. We're going to start off with Institute Senior Fellow Caroline Freund. Caroline has been Senior Fellow at the Institute now for 3 years, just about. She, of course, is the author of the recent book, Rich People, Poor Countries, which has been well reviewed in a number of places, including the Economist and the FT. And I encourage you all to buy it for Mother's Day and give it to as many people as possible. Caroline was Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and had a distinguished career in both the bank and at the Federal Reserve, publishing academic studies and applied research on trade issues. She'll be followed by Gary Clyde Hufbauer, who, of course, is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow here at the Institute, and as Fred Bergson and I both always say, the most valuable person in the building because he does more than 3 other people ever do. Gary is at the leading edge of discussions of trade, of taxation, of investment, and continues to adapt to the new world, churning out blog posts, rebutting nonsense about trade left and right. I'm delighted to have Gary speaking today. Third speaker will be our colleague Aaditya Mattoo, who is research manager for trade and integration at the World Bank. He specializes in trade policy analysis and international trade agreements. He's been at the bank now since 1999, and we've obviously benefited from his work and his collegiality many occasions. Prior to joining the bank, he was economic counselor at the World Trade Organization and previously taught economics at the University of Sussex and at Cambridge University in the UK. After our 3 sort of more research-based presentations, we're going to transition. Our close colleague, Susan Lund from the McKinsey Global, who is one of the leaders of the McKinsey Global Institute, as well as a partner at McKinsey, will give us the insights that McKinsey Global Institute has developed recently on digital trade, which has been making news as so many of their publications do. And of course, so many of their publications have Susan as a co-author or as a leader. And we are very glad to be working with her and other colleagues from McKinsey Global Institute as they bridge the micro insights from business with some of the bigger macro type issues that we struggle with ourselves. And then finally, we will have Ralph Carter, another good friend and someone I'm delighted has been willing to come on stage on this occasion. Ralph is Managing Director of Legal, Trade, and International Affairs for FedEx Express, which is what it sounds like. He's responsible for FedEx's policies on global trade and trade facilitation. He plays a huge role in the business community's thoughtful efforts to move forward trade in a responsible way throughout the world, and particularly on behalf of the U.S. Before he established FedEx's Legal, Trade, and International Affairs office in Washington, he was managing director of the FedEx headquarters, the legal department of FedEx headquarters in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And previously, he worked at the United States Department of State, including as special assistant to the United States ambassador to the European Union. And he will, I hope, give us additional business perspective because FedEx actually knows everything that's coming to your house and therefore is well prepared. It's an all-star lineup. I've introduced everyone at once to make sure that the flow of good thinking is uninterrupted. And so let me turn first to my colleague, Caroline Freund. Caroline.
Thanks, Adam, and I'll jump right in so as not to use up too much of my time with pleasantries. So my view is that the slowdown in trade largely reflects an investment slump. And what I'm going to tie this to is secular stagnation, that actually it's very consistent with some of the arguments that Larry Summers has been making about the underinvestment, especially in advanced countries. So there are some strong consistencies between the trade slowdown and the investment, between the trade slowdown and secular stagnation. And weak trade is largely a symptom of this, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about it because it's also a transmission mechanism around the world. So let me just jump right in and show you what exactly is the concern. So from 1990 to 2007, trade was growing at about twice the rate of world GDP. There was this sharp drop that kind of caught trade economists off guard. But perhaps even more surprising is this sudden change where trade has been growing roughly in line with GDP, and you can see that sort of flat portion at the end, or after especially after the crisis. And I think if trade had continued growing at twice the rate of GDP, trade would be about 15% higher now than it actually is. So it's a really big difference than what we were seeing previously. But when people talk about this, they often start with 1990 because that's where you see this steep rise and then this stagnation. If you go back to 1960, you can see that actually the relationship between trade and GDP isn't so constant after all. So there are periods when trade is very strong and periods when it isn't with respect to GDP. So this isn't the first time we've seen this kind of slowdown. And in fact, in 1990, there were papers saying trade is now growing more slowly than GDP, what's going on? And that was right before it took off. So just as a reminder, things do change over time. So I want to just present some facts. So when you think about trade and growth, we should think about why these things even should be connected. And I think one important thing is there's no rule saying that trade has to grow faster than GDP. It doesn't come out of one of our models or anything. So there isn't a concern from that perspective. There are also some of the things you'll read about trade. It really, really, really depends whether you're looking at values or volumes, because trade is mainly goods. So when you have things like a commodity price shock, you see trade really plummet in the double digits, trade values, but that doesn't mean trade volumes have fallen. You have a 50% cut in the price of oil. Oil's about 20% of trade. You're going to see a sharp drop in trade. So that's one issue. Another, when we think about trade and GDP in the relationship, trade is largely goods, 80% goods actually. GDP is 70% services. So this is another reason why we wouldn't necessarily expect trade to grow in a lockstep with or in a certain relationship with GDP, because they're comprised of different components. And in fact, services trade, even since the crisis, has continued growing at about 5% faster, clearly, than GDP growth at an annual rate. And finally, there's an issue when we think about trade versus GDP, because trade is a gross measure. We just sum up everything that's moving around, and GDP is a value-added measure. So especially during periods of supply chain formation, you have, semiconductors jumping around the world, and we're counting those every time, whereas we only count the value added with GDP. So when you're forming those things, you're going to have an abnormal boost in trade. Part of it's real, there's more trade, but part of it is this double counting. And that's part of what happened in the 1990s. So that was kind of an exceptional period of trade growth. The main point that I'd like to stress today is about trade and investment. So world trade is especially sensitive to investment. So one paper that's published in the American Economic Journal Macro Annual shows that during the trade collapse, investment, the slump in investment in different countries around the world was 8 times as important as the consumption collapse. Investment contributed a third of the drop, that huge drop in trade. Consumption, only 4%. And it makes sense if you look at the composition of trade. So 40% of merchandise trade is in machinery and transport equipment. So this is, this is trade that follows really big investment projects being done around the world. And year-on-year growth in private investment in advanced countries was 2% in recent years, as compared with over 3% prior to the crisis. So this is going to have an effect on trade volumes. And I think one reason to be concerned about the drop of trade is that it kind of is a transmission mechanism for the slowdown in growth or investment slump. So the advanced countries slow down, then exports from emerging markets slow down, investment opportunities there slow down. So this can also serve as kind of a transmission mechanism. And in the last year, investment has dropped even more globally because of the sharp decline in energy extraction, which, you know, the energy projects are about 10% of global investment. So for all these reasons, it's not particularly surprising that we do see this trade slump. And I think it goes a long way in explaining most of the reason trade has slowed down. One thing you sometimes hear is that, and I'm sorry to preempt Aaditya a bit, but maybe this can be a point for discussion later, is that supply chains are shortening. There's reshoring. I just really don't see this in the data. So I believe that the supply chain formation caused that boom we saw in trade during the 90s. But if we look using the basic economic classification, which allows me to separate parts and components into the two main categories, machinery and transport equipment, what we see is that machinery and transport equipment overall trade fell a lot. That's the bars on the right. Capital and transport equipment as a share of total non-fuel trade fell really remarkably from the pre-crisis to post-crisis period. But the share of that trade that's parts and components, of machinery and transport that's parts and components, actually increased slightly. So it seems to me that these production chains are largely intact. So finally, and this is my last slide, the trade slowdown is largely a symptom of the investment slump, and this is consistent with secular stagnation, and I have a blog kind of to correspond with this talk on the topic. There is a danger that trade is transmitting this problem. So, you know, looking forward, I would say liberalization is needed more than ever. So liberalization can get trade going again. It can also help to create new investment opportunities around the world. So it's one of the reforms that can help get us out of this period of slower growth and slower trade. Especially new liberalization in countries like Brazil and India, which could set off a new wave of supply chain formation. And also new technology and deeper integration could finally bring us the services trade boom that we've been waiting for. And actually, I think Susan's going to talk about it, but I think there's a lot of indications that the technology boom is happening and could very well set off that services trade boom that will change things. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I want to start by thanking my colleague, Eugen Young, who did a lot of work with me on this. As often happens in human affairs, Shakespeare provides the clue. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. So the macro is the stars. We are the underlings because we aren't attending to our own faults. The story that Carolyn gave is basically summarized here. We had a very robust growth between 1945 and 2005 of about 6% annual growth in real terms, and the global foreign direct investment stock was growing about 15% annually in nominal terms. Since the Great Recession, as Carolyn pointed out, things are not doing well. This is the longest period of relative trade stagnation. I'll come to a chart on that in a moment. And the world FDI stock is growing relative to world GDP, but the flows have dropped sharply. Here's the relevant chart. You look at the previous times of slow growth in trade, goods and services relative to GDP, and they're much shorter in time than what we are now experiencing. If you look at just and I'm talking about volume, I'm not talking about values. When you look at the figure of, growth in trillions of dollars, of course it's growing, but it's relative to GDP that the slowdown is important, and that's also true in the investment stock, which is still growing, but relative it's not doing so well. So let's look at the global foreign direct investment outflows. This has really come down quite sharply since the peak in the 2007 period. Now let's come to the causes of this unfortunate happening, and there it is, right there. You look at the history of our rounds, just focus on the last column, and look at the spacing in time. They are getting slower and slower, as we well know from the Doha round, which is 21 years and is not making much progress. You might say, well, there's a lot of things happening elsewhere, but the last two significant liberalizations were the Uruguay round quite a while ago, and China's accession to the WTO in 2001, which is now about 15 years ago. Doha round is stalled because of the reticence of developing countries to liberalize either agriculture or non-agriculture. Bilateral U.S. free trade agreements, yes, they are important, but they're not large in the world scale of things. The largest in recent times has been U.S.-Korea, and Eugene and I applaud that. It's just not that big in world affairs. In addition, the 2008 financial crisis triggered a wave of micro-protectionism. Now, our macroeconomists, they can't find it in their data, so it doesn't exist. I mean, the lamppost isn't there for them. And so in the fund, there's not much attention to micro-protectionism. But some of us dig around in the weeds, and we find a lot of this stuff. In fact, the Global Trade Alert out of St. Gallen has found some 3,500 of these micro-protectionist items. Hard to count, hard to identify the effect. We made a huge effort to just find the ones that are engaged in local content requirements, of which the Buy America was the grandfather of all these, and we did try to add up the numbers, and you can see we got a pretty big number, but that's just a fraction of the total of this micro-protectionism which is going on. Now, the people who see it in our stars, which is to say the macroeconomy and investment stagnation and so forth, what they don't pay attention to is the fact that over history, since the Second World War, it's always been the opening of new margins of liberalization that have created those remarkable statistics of 6% growth over this long period of time up to 2005, a good more than 50 years. And there are a lot of margins still there. The barriers that we can measure are very high. Even on manufacturers, everybody thinks that's free. It's not free. It's about 7% on average. The services, the tariff equivalent barriers, as far as we can measure them, are, agriculture stops at maybe 30, 40%, and that's where services start in terms of barriers. And that is the margin that we need liberalization today, and we don't have it. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is a very bright prospect, and I'll come to maybe some statistics on that if time permits, but that still has to be ratified. And I just draw your attention to those things I pulled out from U.S. statistics, which show the potential of trade growth. Not that the world is going to become like the U.S. internal economy, but could it go a good ways in that direction. Domestic trade in the U.S. has a much higher relation to value added than does international trade, and we've got it in our paper. Business services could be 20% of sales from the U.S. They're about 5%, but of course the barriers keep the rest. Outward stocks of foreign direct investment, that's about a quarter of the S&P 500 value, but 3/4 of the world economy is outside the U.S. I mean, the scope is just enormous, but we are not drawing on the scope. Now, I think everybody in this room knows the reason we're not drawing on the potential, and policy liberalization has just come to a halt, basically. The services frontier awaits. The potential is enormous, but the problems of negotiating services are much greater than negotiating goods. And if you look at the TPP agreement, it is, in terms of services liberalization by the United States, the actual liberalization is about zero. We did get liberalization from other countries, but we didn't do any ourselves. Digital trade is a bright spot, and I'm sure that Susan will talk about that. So we have all this opposition here. We have no leadership amongst developing countries. So given this outlook, the prospects for resuming 6% trade growth and even $2 trillion of foreign direct investment are slight, although the potential is there. And if we revive, if our macroeconomists actually do what they should do and revive the world economy, which they haven't, even if we keep this same absence of liberalization and growth of microprotection, my forecast is we'll not get back to the golden era that we had for 50 years after the Second World War. Thank you.
Received an acknowledgement.
Well, I'll shoot somebody afterwards.
Okay.
All right, let's change the order.
Yeah.
Susan, you can use the deck that's up there now, and we will fix this.
All right, thank you, Adam, for having me, and for everyone for attending. I'm going to talk about digital globalization. But first, I'm going to answer the question posed by this lunch this afternoon: what has caused global trade to slow? So Caroline gave a very nice overview, followed by Gary, that there have been ups and downs in global trade, but we are in the last 5 years in a period in which there has been a marked stagnation in growth in the value of trade. And volumes are growing more slowly as well. So it's raised a question of what's happening and should we care? Our answer is it's partly cyclical, but it is partly structural. So I've disaggregated the global trade statistics and goods into three components. The first one on your left is commodities and processed commodities. Not surprisingly, that's fallen the most by 1.1 percentage points of GDP. And that reflects much lower commodity prices, and it also reflects a slowdown in China and fewer imports of hard commodities. It also reflects, for instance, the U.S. production of oil and natural gas. The U.S. last year imported fewer barrels of oil into the U.S. than any year since something like 1980 or 84. So the production of unconventional oil sources in the U.S. has taken another bite out of commodities. But then look at the two segments to the right. Here we've got trade in intermediate goods and then trade in finished products. Now here my data actually conflicts with what Carolyn was saying, so we'll have to compare notes afterwards. But when I measure trade in intermediate goods, it's down slightly and it's stagnated. So this is because of shifts in global value chains. And quite simply, the creation of these long, complex global value chains in manufacturing has pretty much peaked and come to a halt. That the entry of China in particular, but other emerging Asian nations into global manufacturing led to this explosion of complex and long global supply chains. That has now peaked and in many industries seems to be shrinking backwards. It's not really the argument about reshoring, it's more, for instance, consider what's happening in China and the creation of the iPhone that many of you have sitting in front of you. It used to be that the semiconductors were made in Taiwan, parts were made in different parts of Southeast Asia, it was all assembled in China. Well, now all of that's just being produced in China. So the way we count international trade, it's actually a reduction in trade volumes because more of the parts are produced in one place. Then we get to what's happening in finished goods. And here you can see trade has shrunk as well. So this is the production of finished goods. What's happening? Well, part of that could be reshoring. It could be a little bit more manufacturing in the US and Europe. But even more importantly, it's more consumption where the goods are produced in the first place, namely China, but to a lesser extent, other emerging economies. So when we look at the growth in global consumption versus the growth in global trade, you see an interesting pattern. So growth of consumption is shown on the horizontal axis, and growth in trade value is on the vertical axis. And what you can see is for all the types of products in the blue area of this box, below the 45-degree line, you see that there's faster growth in global consumption of the good than there is in trade. So chemicals, transportation equipment, metals, mineral fuels. And what this means is that these goods are being produced where they're consumed rather than in another country and traded. There are other products for which the opposite is true. So apparel, labor-intensive textiles and other things are growing faster than global consumption. So in those sectors of manufacturing, you're still seeing the spread of production to more countries and shipments between countries. Part of the reason that global trade is growing faster than consumption in apparel is the growing South-South trade, or trade between emerging economies. It used to be the case that the majority of that trade was produced in a low-income country and then shipped to a high-income country. That's obviously still important, but increasingly what we see, for instance, is Africa importing labor-intensive goods from China. And so that is one reason why that segment of goods still has faster trade than consumption. So overall, the shifts in value chains and the move of consumption to where the production is means that going forward, we may not see global trade grow as fast as we had in the last 20, 25 years. And that's okay. When we look forward, we can see new technologies on the horizon that could take another bite out of global goods trade. And this is simply 3D printing or additive manufacturing. With these technologies, what will happen is you'll ship a design file around the world digitally, and then you'll use a 3D printer to print the good where it's consumed. Already we see this taking place across businesses. Here are a couple examples. We've got Maersk Tankers, who, by the way, is very concerned about the slowdown in goods trade, but at the same time is 3D printing replacement parts on its tankers rather than storing them centrally in one location. You've got GE, you have the U.S. Army and Navy starting to 3D print supplies out in the field. You have humanitarian and disaster relief organizations like Field Ready starting to print medical devices in the field where they're needed rather than shipping them around the world. Now, 3D printing is still in its infancy. It's actually a technology that's been around for decades, but in the last few years, there have been advances to make it lower cost and better quality. So it's starting to take off across different sectors of the economy. So right now, I don't think that this explains virtually any of the slowdown in global trade. But 10 years out, you can imagine that there could be a chunk of goods that are no longer shipped around the world. Think about what happened to books or movies or video games or software. Those things used to be physical goods that were mailed around, shipped across borders, and now it's all a digital file. So there is a certain component of global manufacturing that could become a digital file with the actual physical good printed where it is. Now, does this matter? Should we care? Caroline pointed out global trade doesn't need to grow faster than global GDP or even as fast as global GDP. The benefits from trade are multifold, one of which is it enables countries to do what they do best, produce what they should specialize in. It creates competition. It enables a good idea in one place to be used in another, to be built upon. It enables companies to get the best talent, the best inputs, the best ideas from around the world and become more competitive. This is where digital globalization comes in. We released a report, there's some copies outside, that argues increasingly the connective tissue of the global economy is no longer big shiploads of goods moving around. It is, in fact, those invisible cross-border data flows. So while global trade has stagnated, this chart shows you cross-border bandwidth between different regions of the world. And this was just back in 2005, so 10 years ago. The vast majority of cross-border internet flows were between the US and Europe. And that's the picture today. It's flowing virtually around the world. The volume is 45 times as great. Cisco says in the next 5 years alone, it'll increase another 9 times. Increasingly, the way the world is connected is through cross-border data flows, not flows of physical goods. Now, what are these cross-border data flows? It is everything. It is email, it is Skype, it's people checking Facebook, it's social media, it's communication within companies that have branches around the world, it's VoIP phone calls, it's Google searches, it includes the public internet, private networks, as well as the so-called dark web that's not publicly searchable. Now, I wish very much that we could disaggregate this, and Adam's giving me the 3-minute warning. We unfortunately can't, so it's hard to know exactly what component is individual person-to-person versus business-related. But digital flows are transforming how business is done. So already today, we calculate that 12% of global goods trade is done digitally. This is simply e-commerce. Half of global services trade is already digitally delivered. And when you look at phone calls, Skype alone accounts for 46% of the international call volume. Digital is transforming trade in 3 ways. First is creation of digital platforms. And this is your Facebook, Coursera. It enables eBay. It enables commerce to be done across borders, connecting buyers and sellers or 2 individuals seamlessly, costlessly, and instantaneously. There's also the creation of digital goods that I talked about. Some goods that used to be physical are now purely digital, and that makes them able to be distributed instantaneously and costlessly, creating global markets. And then finally, we have a concept called digital wrappers. And the easiest example to understand this concept is the radio frequency tags that now accompany every shipment of good around the world. This enables more goods to be shipped. It dramatically reduces the value of goods lost in transit by 30 to 50%, and it enables companies to ship more valuable goods because now they can keep an eye on where it is. So all of this together is creating new ways that digital is transforming how we even think about trade. And I'll leave you with one slide, which is this chart shows you global cross-border business-to-consumer e-commerce. So by 2020, it's projected there are going to be 1 billion people online shopping and buying stuff directly from other countries. And that's going to be worth $1 trillion. So right now, global goods trade, including commodities and fuel, is about 17 trillion. That is a sizable number. And I'll leave you with this here because we do a terrible job at measuring this stuff. This comes from the e-commerce industry, but national statistics, when they're looking at trade, were designed in an area where trade meant big container shiploads of goods coming into a port and unloaded. Well, increasingly, you can go on to Amazon, as I did actually last Halloween, and unbeknownst to me, the costume that I ordered for one of my daughters was coming directly from China. Now, as it happens, even on Prime, it did not come in 2 days. It took 3 weeks. But I wondered, how was this $45 package being delivered directly from China to my house, captured in trade statistics? It's under the de minimis for which it needs to be declared through customs. But if, in a few years, we've got $1 trillion of commerce being shipped around by FedEx, we'll hear from. Good news for FedEx. Very bad news for economists who like to use national data to study these things. So increasingly, I think digital is going to make it, if nothing else, very difficult to even measure how many goods and services are crossing borders.
I've been asked to kill 1 minute while they sort of.
Give that to her.
No, but I'm going to use that time. I feel a little bit embarrassed coming after you. It's like, you've been watching Interstellar, and now I'm taking you back to the Planet of the Apes. But, I'll use these 1 minute, which I'll beg for a little extra time because it's not my doing, just to say quickly a few things in rebuttal of these excellent presentations that I heard from Caroline and Gary. So first point is that if the 2000s are a period when the trade growth slowed down, are also a period when investment was the fastest growing component of GDP. So the explanation that it has to do with investment may have something, and has almost certainly something to do with the post-recession phenomenon, but can't explain the trade slowdown before the recession. Second, as Caroline herself has pointed out, in order for global value chains and developments in global value chains to matter, it's not that they should be reshoring. It's enough that they stop growing. Third, even now today, one of the striking facts, and I'll show you in a second, and no more preemption now, I'm going to ask 4 quick questions. One, what is happening to global trade? Why does it matter? And was 2015 different? And what does it portend? And my main points are, in substance, very similar to what you have heard, but there are subtle differences, so you have to listen carefully. So first, the trade slowdown is explained in part by maturing value chains. It matters because it may hurt growth, both for what we call Keynesian demand-side reasons and Adam Smithian supply-side reasons. And the third is that there are important changes in China. I don't want to disentangle the structural from the cyclical, but they are going to create new opportunities, and I agree that services trade may be the silver lining. First, if you look at this picture, which is very similar to the picture that Caroline has shown, you will notice that most attention has focused on the dip during the Great Recession and the sluggishness post-recession. But what is interesting is that both in the United States and China, the flatness set in earlier. And then you take a long view, and what is striking, and it has, is one of the most robust statistical findings that I've ever found, is that the period that stands out, if you look over the last 4 decades, are what we call the long 90s. That's, as Caroline said, the period when trade was really growing twice as fast as GDP. Why? First, it wasn't services. As Caroline said, services have been remarkably resilient. It was goods. And within goods, it wasn't commodities, appropriately deflated. It was manufacturing. And then there is an interesting, rigorous finding. Supposing we were to array the manufacturing sectors according to the degree of vertical specialization. So the sectors which are more amenable to fragmentation, like radio communication equipment and so on, are towards the right, and those which are less, like furniture, to the left. You see that the 90s were the period when these sectors showed the fastest growth, for precisely the reason Caroline said, that what was once one car crossing borders was now carburetors, clutches, tires going back and forth, so that measured trade raced ahead of GDP. And interestingly, in the 2000s, it's these precise sectors which saw not a reversal, but a slowing down of fragmentation, and that is sufficient to demonstrate that there was, in fact, an important change in the way the value chains were developing. And the final exhibit is quite striking. China, in the 90s, was specializing in assembly. You look at the share of parts and components in China's exports, total exports, and you see a dramatic growth in the 90s, and then it moved up the value chain, started producing domestically things that it was previously importing, and you see a significant decline in the share of parts and components. And much more careful work by my colleague Qi and Hei Tang, looking at firm-level data, has demonstrated convincingly that it wasn't about changes in industrial composition or even changes in the composition of firms within industries, but individual Chinese firms were producing and buying locally. And that doesn't mean China is turning its back on globalization. A lot of this production came thanks to foreign direct investment. So that's point one. Why do we care? Now, there are people like Paul Krugman who have said it doesn't matter. The world is more open than it has ever been. Many countries are far from the global sort of technology frontier. So the scope for openness to diffuse knowledge and enhance productivity remains significant. I think in part that's true, but there are two ways in which we can look at why it might matter. One is, as I said, a Keynesian view, that because world imports are sluggish, any growth in world incomes today translates into a lower increase in imports, and therefore for any one country, a smaller increase in its exports. We've done some empirical work on this, but I think the more interesting question is what I call the Adam Smith concern, that the slower pace of GVC expansion diminishes the scope for productivity growth through a more finer and finer division of labor, and also limits the kind of knowledge diffusion that goes with it. One more picture which is quite interesting. Again, I array the different industrial sectors according to the degree of vertical specialization or fragmentation. And the blue line represents, or the vertical axis is productivity growth. And the blue line shows the 90s picture. And sure enough, in the 90s, the sectors which saw greater fragmentation are precisely the sectors which saw faster productivity growth. And the great flattening is that this relationship tended to disappear in the 2000s. Was 2015 different? And what are the implications? So our new work, which was released as a trade watch, I should have said all this work is joint work with Michele Ruta and Christina Niagu. What we have shown is that there are two mutually reinforcing factors. One was China's transition, and the other was the decline in commodity prices. Each hurt the other. China stopped buying more commodities, and the commodity producers stopped buying from China, or bought less. I don't know how much of this we should call structural, how much are long cycles, but these are the two things that happen. And what's interesting is, this is again, a sort of blurred picture, which is a reflection on how sure I am of what is happening. But you see that the countries which are more exposed to China are precisely the ones which saw a 1% higher exposure in terms of China's share in your exports meant a third of a percent slower growth rate in exports. But there's an interesting reversal of fortune. Here now, on the left, you see intermediates. And those countries which had been celebrating in the 90s because there was a huge increase in demand for their exports, like Brazil, and even countries like India and Australia, 90% of whose exports to China are raw materials, saw as much as a 25% decline in their exports. That's the left picture. But at the same time, consumer goods exporters, the UK and Vietnam had one thing in common. About a third of their exports to China are consumer goods. They have seen a significant growth. So the rebalancing is altering the shape of China's demand for the rest of the world. And one other beneficiary is the services sector. We keep hearing about Chinese tourists going abroad, but you know, China's imports of services, the index for goods has hovered around 100 for the last 5 years. The index for services has increased from 100 to 170 over the same period. And the share of services in China's imports have gone up by 5 percentage points. One quick puzzle I'll leave the macroeconomists in this room with. If we see commodity importers like Russia contracting their imports dramatically by as much as 40%, why is it that commodity exporters are contracting, why don't we see the real income boosts for commodity importers translating into greater imports? In this case, they are. That's a picture of Turkey, an increase in exports by 40%. But where are these real incomes going? I think it's an interesting question, which I know that you at the Peterson Institute have been thinking about it. But let me just return quickly in the last 30 seconds to services. As Caroline said, services trade was remarkably resilient. It didn't fall as much as goods trades during the crisis, and it has been growing much faster after the crisis. While, as Gary very nicely demonstrated, the scope for liberalization in goods is also flattening it out. You can't go much below zero tariffs. The scope for further reform in services is huge, especially in sectors like transport. And that could have a huge double benefit. There is scope for much finer divisions, not just within services, but even inter-industry trade, intra-industry trade, all of which happened in goods after the Second World War is just beginning to happen in services. And thanks to demographic changes which are creating mismatches between demand and supply, and the digitization that Suzanne spoke about, which is making trade feasible, we are bound to see faster and faster growth. And at the same time, parts of the world like South America, South Asia, and Africa, if they were to reform their services sectors, the trade costs might decline, and their opportunities to become part of new value chains may grow. But I cannot resist ending with one line, that the TPP is not the silver bullet which is transforming services sectors. But that's a subject for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be back at the Peterson Institute. I think it's the best discussion in town. It's also the best food in town. So I thank Adam for the invitation. It's always intimidating for me to speak after economists. I'm not an economist, so I don't have any graphs for you. I'm here to give you kind of an anecdotal view of what we see as FedEx kind of operating in the trade space around the world. It's also the second time in 2 consecutive days that I've followed people that talked about how 3D printing is going to put our business out of business in the future. You didn't mention drones. That's the other issue that we frequently look at. But in fact, we just announced our earnings, our third quarter earnings not long ago, and they were quite good. And in fact, as was mentioned, e-commerce is a huge opportunity for us and it's driving big volumes, especially here in the United States, but around the world as well. You mentioned the $1 trillion cross-border figure in 2020. I'll give you another one that'll open your eyes. Last November, China celebrated what Alibaba created as a holiday for single people. It's their own Valentine's Day. And the idea is you buy yourself a present online. And in one 24-hour period, the Chinese bought $14 billion worth of goods. And if you compare that to, if you add the U.S. Black Friday and Cyber Monday sales, online sales together, ours were about 3. So that gives you the scale of what's going on in China. And it's growing at least 20% a year. That figure from 2015 was 60% more than they did on the previous year in 2014. So we think it's a bright future if we get the policy environment right, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we do, in our global business, we do see the softening of the trade since the financial crisis. Some of what we see, I think the comments on the shortening of the supply chain is interesting. We still carry a lot of parts around the world. But what we do see is a couple of things. One, because of the greater visibility into the supply chain made possible by RFID and other technologies that allow companies to have greater visibility on time, online, and real-time visibility into their supply chains, allows them to control them much better, to have more reliability and more predictability. The second factor is interest rates have been so low for so long that changes the economics around holding inventory. And sometimes they can hold inventory closer to their customers rather than having us move it around for them. And so we do see that. And so we are shifting, we're seeing demand for slower services, more deferred services at lower price points because they're able to manage their inventory differently. The production chain is still set up, but they're managing the flow of those goods through those chains slightly differently than they were in the past. And we are reacting to that and producing and coming up with more deferred services around the world to help take advantage of that trend. I'm not going to get into the other causes that were mentioned by the folks who spoke before me. What I will talk about is, in our experience, I could just confirm what Gary said about micro protectionism. We work in virtually every country that you can as a U.S. company, about 220 countries around the world. And Gary talked about micro protectionism. Maybe what we see is atomic or even subatomic level protectionism. We see what happens at the border when you're having to get goods across the border. And what we're seeing is an increase, and since the financial crisis, of very small bore barriers that are being put up just to slightly and subtly slow and add cost to trade. It may be an additional signature, an additional stamp, an additional document, some small little thing that just, again, when you add them all up, it makes the process more expensive and time-consuming for companies like us who are having to go through and get those goods cleared across the borders. And so e-commerce is also a big target of this because a lot of countries, the finance departments, let's say, the customs departments, view e-commerce as a threat rather than an opportunity. They're not seeing it as an offensive opportunity for their small businesses to start selling around the world. They're seeing it as a revenue threat. And this is creating kind of a negative self-fulfilling prophecy where since the crisis, trade volumes have gone down. Customs administrations, finance administrations, especially in countries that rely to a large extent on customs revenue for part of their government budgets, are feeling the pinch. And what they're doing is they're trying to tighten up their controls at the border and try to squeeze out as much money as they can from their imports. But what that really does is slow down trade. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. By trying to get more money out of it, they're actually making it harder and slowing it down. Our chairman on the call, he likened this to barnacles on a boat. They're small, but if you get enough of them over time, it's going to slow that boat down. And he says that's what's happening. We're getting barnacles on the ship of trade, and it's slowing us down. We see it around the world. Latin America is a particular concern, but we're also seeing it in Asia. Gary mentioned the importance of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. We couldn't agree more. This is an agreement that'll have kind of binding standards for 160 countries around the world to raise their customs performance. We think once we get this, we've got 74 ratifications, we need 108. So we've got to get it ratified, and then we've got to get it implemented. And I think once we do, we can help start to shave off some of those barnacles and speed the flow of goods again and increase trade. I will say that the U.S. is an important exception in this area because just last month you may have seen that the U.S. had a new customs implementation bill that raised the U.S. de minimis level from $200 to $800. So previously, if you flew into the United States on your vacation, you could bring in up to $800 duty-free. But if you shipped that same good with FedEx, anything over $200 was dutiable. Now those are equal. So we think this is going to be a huge boon to e-commerce in the United States, and that's why we promote this, and we urge the U.S. government to promote this around the world as the single most effective regulatory tool you could do to spur more cross-border e-commerce. I'll finish with another anecdote about a trip I took to Geneva last week with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We met with 16 or 18 Geneva delegations, and lots of discussion, obviously, about kind of where the WTO goes from here, what to do with the old Doha agenda items, and what new items the WTO should be taking on. A lot of discussion, not a lot of consensus on the way forward. But one comment that I heard several times that I thought was notable and distressing was that there seems to be no appetite for new liberalization. Nobody's pushing for liberalizing of goods or services. The only thing they're really talking about is kind of the legacy issues of ag subsidies and stock holdings of agricultural products. And so it was kind of a distressing picture to hear that nobody's really pushing for liberalization. And that's why I think it's so important that the U.S. continue to exert leadership and to push this agenda, very ambitious agenda, that we have online with the TPP and the TTIP and services and the IGA and the EGA. We need to keep those wheels spinning so that we can continue to knock down barriers and keep the trade flows going. So I think I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you to all the speakers. If I could ask you to come up and sit in the order in which you spoke. Thanks particularly to Susan and Aaditya for rolling with the flow as we had a micro protection on our PowerPoint flow. This has been, I think, even by our usual high standards, an exceptionally rich, in the best sense, disagreements, constructive reinforcement, interesting analysis of data, all in a form that's both relevant and accessible. I really want to commend the speakers. I want to give our distinguished audience, we've extended lunch longer than we usually do to give our audience a chance for on-the-record discussion with the speakers, and all of their PowerPoints will be available online along with the video and the transcript of this event and links to their various related work later today, early tomorrow. But first, I just want to ask whether Carolyn or Gary, since you didn't have the benefit of following the other speakers, if you had any quick responses. Doesn't have to be a debate response. It could be Gary saying to Ralph, thanks very much. But anyway, some quick responses to the people who spoke after you.
Oh, thank you. I would take one, which is just on this shortening of supply chains. I think it's really important how you look at it. And actually, I found Susan's data to be in line with mine because, yeah, intermediates fell, but they fell less than finished goods. So they're still being used to the same extent in the finished goods. there's just less demand out there for those finished goods. So it's not about a shortening of a supply chain, it's just about lower demand, and especially of the investment goods. But I think our data was very consistent.
Very good. Gary?
Well, the note of optimism is certainly on digital, and so I want to throw in just a caution on that. There are virtually no rules agreed today on digital trade apart from the draft in the TPP. And what this means is that it's a green field for the kind of things that Ralph Carter talked about to erect barriers. So one of the great achievements of our negotiators going forward, if in fact they do any work, is to put in rules that keep digital as open in 10 years as it is now.
Great. Thank you all very much. Let me now open it up to the floor. It's our usual rules. There's a traveling mic up front, which Jessica has. There's a standing mic in back. If you're close to the standing mic, go stand there. When I recognize you, please identify yourself and try to ask a question rather than make a speech. The gentleman there, please.
Thanks so much for having this. I guess I just wanted to...
You identify yourself, please?
Yes, Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you.
Reporter, news side. I just wanted to ask, I guess, whether it's the lack of investment that's leading to the slowdown of trade or something to do with the global value change that may also, as Mr. Mattoo pointed out, be connected to lack of investment. Where are we seeing that lack of, I assume it's FDI, cross-border investment? Who is not providing the investment? Who's not getting it? Or what is causing the secular stagnation? Obviously, there may be lots of things working, but if there are a couple of culprits, if anybody on the panel has identified one, that would be helpful for writing about this trend. Thanks.
Great. So Susan, then Gary, and Aaditya.
Well, one of the big components of slowdown in investment globally is Europe. So when you look at Europe's really stagnant performance since the Great Recession, it's having to do mainly with a slowdown in investment of all types. So business investment, construction, capital spending, CapEx by businesses. And this reflects the fact that you've got a euro crisis, you've got perhaps an EU crisis, and there's a real uncertainty and lack of aggregate demand. In the U.S., business investment has actually held up, and it's been more on the construction, real estate side that's dragged down aggregate figures, although residential is now starting to pick up as well.
Thank you. Gary?
Contrary to what one might hear on the campaign trail, most overseas investment is not in manufacturing. That's less than a fifth. Most of it is in services. Most of it takes place by M&A. And the resistance to M&A in many countries is extremely strong. You just cannot buy some of these service firms in China, for example, if you're a European or a U.S. firm. And that's a big part of the slowdown.
Thank you. Aaditya?
I think, and I agree with Gary, twice as much FDI today stocks are in services as in manufacturing. But I think there's an interesting distinction between investment per se as a share of aggregate demand. And I think what links the two arguments about changing investment shares, especially within China, to value chains, is that it's investment which typically is associated with these long value chains and these capital goods. But surprisingly, we don't yet see a contraction, for example, in capital goods imports of the kind that you would have expected if there had really been a serious shift from investment to consumption in China.
Thank you. And then Caroline had raised her hand as well.
Investment, as I mentioned, is very import intensive. So it's not just FDI, it's the overall investment, I think, that is contributing to the slowdown. And initially, it was really in the advanced countries, whether it's, lack of infrastructure spending in the U.S. and overall slowdown in Europe. And in recent years, it's spread to the emerging markets, and most recently in the energy sector. And just a quick note on the supply chain aspect, the growing supply chains really contributed to the boom in trade in the 90s, but I really don't think they're falling apart. They just aren't continuing to develop at the rate they were developing in the 90s. And I think that's something the speakers all kind of broadly agree on.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for the question. Who would like to be next, please? Oh, come on. Yes, please. Could you go to the back mic?
Hi, Jun Kuroda from Japanese Embassy. I'm wondering if anybody could comment on possible other elements of slowing down of trade. I can think such as security issues or flow of money, such as trade, credit, these things. But if you can think of any other things, that'd be great.
I think our colleagues all will have an opinion on this. I'll just say on the security issue side, that should be a pretty, unless we think there's been a generalized reduction in security of shipping, that the U.S. Navy has ceased to make the world a better place, that should be very heavily biased to particular trade relationships. I'm not saying it isn't true, but I'm saying there should be a testable way to figure that out. But anyway, that's just stalling for time. Aaditya.
I think, one interesting aspect is when you think of security, not just in the sort of purely law and order sense, but a broader sense, whether it's financial insecurity, whether it is data insecurity, whether it is old age insecurity. I think each of these dimensions of security have a profound effect on services markets. When you think of the EU concerns about data privacy and how they threaten to cut off data flows, I think the Privacy Shield and its earlier incarnation, the Safe Harbor, are examples. I think it's one example where the TPP actually did something remarkable by not just insisting on free data flows, but also imposing obligations on exporting countries to watch out for the interests of consumers in the areas of fraud or privacy. And I think there it was truly a sort of pioneering. I have to say this because in other respects, I think there is more hype than substance.
Ralph?
The only thing I was going to mention, which I didn't notice in the presentations was, and this is a question rather, is whether access to finance, trade finance, has an impact since the financial crisis.
I think, Gary, Carolyn, Susan, somebody can comment on that, but my understanding is we saw a huge natural experiment when the French and some other European banks got out of trade finance at the start of the crisis, and it did have an immediate immense effect, but that there has been a lot of substitution of new forms of finance pretty rapidly, but that's my surface understanding. Gary, then Susan, then Carolyn.
Well, Jeff Schott and I heard the other day from an informed person at the World Trade Organization that there's quite a move to bolster trade finance for developing and emerging countries, where the trade finance is quite absent because banks don't want to go into that field. So that would be one area of credit which possibly makes quite a difference.
Great. Susan?
Yeah, I would echo what you said, Adam, that I think that there was a big contraction as banks started rethinking their business lines under new regulations, but that there have been new sources of trade finance in aggregate. Now, I have no doubt that there are specific emerging markets who may be constrained in this regard. And there was an earlier question about, well, where is the foreign direct investment not going? It is the lowest income countries that are seeing the biggest drop. So Africa, South Asia, et cetera, that are suddenly being cut out of the flow of foreign investment.
This is something which we might think about, coming off your question, is exploiting a little bit the cross-sectional variation in some of the very good scatter plots and other charts that we had about, is it sub-Saharan Africa, is it the commodity exporters, is it low income, and teasing some of this out. Carolyn, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about export credit agencies.
Turn on your mic, please.
I'm sorry, about export credit agencies. So there's been an explosion in export credit agency financing around the world. So to that extent, I think trade is very well financed, except in one country, and that's, of course, the U.S., where the export credit agency, Exim Bank, remains constrained.
Well done. At the back mic, please. Could the people in back line up by the back mic, and then we'll be able to recognize you. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much, Adam. Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD Geneva. The panel was really interesting and excellent presentations. Congratulations. This is obviously a subject that's so such a conundrum in many ways and yet so important for the world economy. I'm just wondering, a couple of things came to mind. One is more technical. Caroline mentioned that, in terms of trade, you said that only about 25% is services and the rest is, in fact, manufacturers, but actually that's not really true if we look at it in value-added terms, where in value-added terms, we know now from the new value-added database that the WTO and the OECD have put out that services are, in fact, 50% of world trade and growing in importance. And so you say that we measure trade differently than GDP because GDP is measured as value-added basis and trade on a gross basis. Wonder if we started measuring them both on a value-added basis, if that would change any of our perspective. That's one question to the panel, or to Caroline or the panel. And the other is that it's true that the investment flows have dropped off the most in the countries that seem to be exactly those parts of the world that do not participate heavily in value chains. So it means that basically, even though the value chains are slowing, nonetheless, the participation rates are still skewed toward those countries that have become attached to the hubs of the value chain centers. And that is obviously a worrying fact for the world economy.
Any reactions? Yeah, Caroline.
Just to say, so the question is about value added in goods. So basically, goods themselves involve services. And I couldn't agree more. And actually, I looked at that data to see if we could look at the value added trade, elasticity to income. But unfortunately, that data doesn't go through recent years. So maybe a few years from now, we can answer your question. But I think it is the right way to go. If we assume that data is well calculated. And then I think the other question was about participation. And I think it's, supply chains could still grow a lot if a lot of the countries that aren't in them were to liberalize and join them. So that's the Indias, the Brazils, countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So I think there's a lot of room for advancement. We just haven't seen that liberalization yet. So to that effect, and again, I think the panel's pretty much in line on this, that further liberalization could ignite another boom in trade.
Thank you, Aaditya, Susan.
Quick observation. Sorry, Susan, do you want to go first?
No.
That we have actually looked at the value-added trade data for the period that we have, and it is as expected and as Caroline anticipated, shows a much more stable elasticity, which confirms the idea that a lot of this is a consequence of the way the back and forth there comes fragmentation. I just want to say one thing about FDI in Africa. Again, even in Africa, FDI in services is more than twice as much as FDI in manufacturing.
Susan?
I was just going to add on, what does all this mean for low-income countries? I mean, I'm of two minds. On one hand, there's clearly still an opportunity for the poorest countries in the world to get involved in global value chains. Not because I think they're lengthening, I don't, but I do think they're shifting. So, for instance, if you take labor-intensive manufacturing of textiles, toys, shoes, furniture, a lot of that is starting to move out of China into Bangladesh, into Ethiopia. And so there are opportunities for low-income countries to join in global value chains and have prosperity. But I think that that's a closing window. I don't think that will be open forever. And I think that on top of the imperative of what it takes to get involved in that, which is good physical logistics infrastructure, you now have a digital infrastructure that they need to take advantage of. Ralph mentioned that, look, global platforms in e-commerce means that I can buy a good from China, but it also means that small companies anywhere in the world can be exporters. But in order to do that, you need affordable internet access and really broadband access. And right now, although a large share of the world's population has a 2G mobile phone, 3G is much less common, and high-speed internet access to really truly participate is even more limited still. So now the poorest countries that are still trying to build their ports, their airports, their roads, also need to build a digital infrastructure to participate in the global economy. So I do worry about the fact that those left behind may be even further left behind.
Thank you, Gary. Did you want to? Okay. Lady at the back mic, please.
Hi, Show Chandra with Bloomberg News. I wanted to find out what each of the panel speakers think about the impact on employment from the slowdown in global trade, especially in the context of some of the sub-themes that were mentioned, such as shifting global supply chains, the digital cross-border flows that are forecast to rise. Where will the trade-related jobs of the future be, developed versus developing countries, and what will they look like? Thank you.
Anyone?
Susan, I nominate.
Well, I nominate Gary, then Susan.
Okay, what does it mean for employment? Well, I think that it depends on whose employment you're talking about. I think in the U.S. there has been very good work shown that there was, in fact, this exodus of 5 million manufacturing jobs over the last 15 years, and that was basically labor-intensive textiles and furniture production moving to China, by and large, and other low-income countries. But that is a structural transition that we're now through. That's gone. Nobody's talking about that being reshored. The renaissance in manufacturing in the U.S. is in much higher value-added goods. In other countries, as we talked about, there is opportunity to employ more people in production for global markets and manufacturing. India has realized belatedly that it missed out on the first wave of that and is trying to get into global manufacturing. So I think for low-income countries, there is an opportunity. But at the same time that we talk about trade and jobs, I have to bring up automation, because I think as important to the future of employment as trade is in creating jobs or destroying jobs, we have to keep in mind that technology is moving ahead very rapidly and automating many routine types of jobs. So increasingly in manufacturing, a shrinking pool of global manufacturing is actually heavily dependent on labor to begin with. Manufacturing is high productivity, lots of value added, but fewer and fewer jobs. And the categories of goods that, in fact, are sensitive to wages and employ a lot of people is getting smaller and smaller as automation advances.
And, of course, our colleagues, Robert Lawrence and Arvind Subramanian, each in their own ways have written about these trends, the premature, in a sense, deindustrialization or skipped industrialization in India by Arvind, and the long-term downward trends in manufacturing employment, even as trade grows, by Robert. Gary, and then Carolyn and Aaditya.
Well, the big point on trade and employment is that freer trade agreements make very little difference to aggregate employment, hardly measurable. Aggregate employment is determined by macro factors and not by trade agreements. What trade agreements or freer trade does is to shift jobs, not to change either on an upward direction or a downward direction the number of jobs. Even if we take the Autor, Dorn, and Hansen findings of 2.5 million more unemployment in the affected metropolitan statistical areas over a 10-year period, if you divide that into 10 years, roughly it's about 500,000 or 250,000 a year. U.S. aggregate employment is 150 million now. Aggregate job churn per year is 30 million. So even that headline statistic, which has gotten a lot of attention, perhaps rightfully so, almost disappears in the decimal point in the overall employment churn picture and certainly in the overall employment picture.
Carolyn?
I was actually going to make the same point as Gary, just to emphasize that while manufacturing employment has gone down, manufacturing value added has actually gone up. So kind of to ride on the previous comments, automation's a big part of this technology.
Aaditya?
Just two quick points. One on manufacturing itself. You know, on the one hand, we've been celebrating value chains, but I think the nature of intercompatibility required in value chains itself dictates capital-intensive technology because parts have to fit together. And that is a pattern which actually is inimical to the generation of employment. That's one point. On services, I think there has been in services trade, especially a kind of employment pessimism, which people like Danny Roderick and others have also argued about, that somehow the services that are tradable are precisely those which are skill intensive. Now, some new work we've done with a value, direct and indirect employment database shows it's very surprising that Indian services exports, $1,000 of Indian services exports creates more unskilled employment than $1,000 of Indian manufacturing exports. When you look at not just the direct employment, but all the indirect employment that goes in when Infosys creates grand new buildings for themselves, or canteens, or all the linked indirect services. And that proportion, in fact, is comparable with the proportion of unskilled employment created not by the distorted Indian manufacturing sector, but the Chinese manufacturing sector.
That's fascinating. At the back, Mike.
Thank you very much. My name is Fadil Yaqub. I'm from the Egyptian Embassy. My question actually is to the panel in regard to the TPP and TTIP. Some concerns actually saying that the United States and the other economy, like the European Union, are taking the global trade agenda from the WTO out of the WTO. So how much do you agree with this? And the second part of my question is, can we see any concrete relations between the struggling of the WTO and making mechanism regarding the liberalization of trade since the Doha ministerial meeting and the slowdown of the global trade we can see and experience it nowadays? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Ralph, because he was making that linkage to some degree in his opening remarks, if you wanted to give us some comments.
Sure. I mean, as everybody has seen, it's become incredibly difficult to move any multilateral initiative forward in the WTO. And I wouldn't characterize it as taking an initiative from the WTO. It's simply a manifestation of the manifest failure of the organization to be able to come together on liberalization over the last 13 years, and the desire to keep liberalizing and to find other countries that share that view and to move forward. And I think the approach that we'll probably see more of is this critical mass, like-minded countries coming together and saying anyone's welcome to participate if you're willing to make the kinds of ambitious commitments that we want to make. And from a business perspective, we've always said we would always rather have a multilateral set of rules or a multilateral solution. But if that's not possible, let's go with the second best alternative and try to capture as much global percentage of the particular trade or commodity or service sector that you're trying to do, and get strong commitments for that. If it means there are free riders, probably that's okay as long as you've got the bulk of the trade covered. And then that continues to move the liberalization agenda forward and sets high standards. And hopefully other countries will see the benefits of those agreements and move in that same direction.
Thank you, Ralph. We're coming to the end of our even extended time, so this will be the last question, please.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Monarch from Federal Reserve Board. Aaditya, you showed in your talk that China has been moving up the value chain, we've seen decline in imports or decline in exports of parts and components. But China was also a reason why 2015 might be different, China's transition to the new normal growth. And so taking these together, I thought, I was wondering how far along is China towards what its eventual place in the global chain is. Are we at the beginning still of the transition of China's exports away from intermediate inputs? And that could tell us something about where growth and trade will go in the future. So I was wondering if you had an idea of how far along China's transition of exports is, or how much longer trade will be slowing down. Thank you.
I think that's a really thoughtful question, and one of the flaws in my presentation was that I didn't really integrate these two views, and I think the way you're posing the issue. I think instead of, given that time is short, let me just say two things right now. One, I don't think people realize that China exports already more services than India. China has also a big stake in its interior. I think while we are spending a lot of political and emotional energy on agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP, which are really not changing the situation on the ground a lot, I think this talk that you're going to have tomorrow, which I'd love to attend, is really the more fundamental infrastructural connectivity. When I read Guns, Germs, and Steel, I learned to see things along the lines of latitude and Eurasia. I think that's what's happening in China, that the scope for relocating production within China hasn't really been exhausted. But there are certain fundamentals like the demographic change, which is going to change the workforce, but we have done some new work which looks at differences in patterns of consumption across age groups, and it's striking how that is also going to alter the structure of consumption towards services. So I think the question you're asking is a wonderful question, but I can only give you these 2 or 3 suggestions.
Thank you, Aaditya. It's wonderful when one of our guests does the advertising for me, just as Ralph did in his remarks. I'm very grateful to all 5 of our panelists. I'll just reiterate from Aaditya, we're going to have another exciting event here tomorrow, not only with Simeon Jankov and Sean Miner, but with several leading economists from the China Development Research Foundation to talk about these issues. And those of you who are invited today were no doubt invited for that tomorrow, or tune in online. I would also just say that this is obviously a discussion that, again, I just want to thank the speakers, all 5 of them, that I thought made really substantive, tight, despite even with my timing threats, coherent presentations and responses, and it's just terrific to have this discussion. And as has been indicated, there's a lot more room for future research in this area. So thank you very much.